One thing that's worth saying is that these solutions embody one important message, which is that the economy is meant to serve society. And therefore, looking simply at economic growth, which is important, is not sufficient. And moving into the future, we'll have to look at a lot more measures, not only environment, but also social measures. And if the people of the G20 understand this, then they will be reassured of the importance of the G20 in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Now the floor is yours, Minister.
Good morning, everybody. Dear Professor Snower, dear Professor Messner, ladies and gentlemen, good friends. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this important forum. I'm a minister. I'm the chief of staff to Angela Merkel in the Chancellery. That means I'm one amongst 15 ministers in German government. The chief of staff in the Chancellery certainly is not the most important minister, but in my specific case, I can say at least I'm the biggest minister in government. And at the end of this electoral period, I can tell you I have successfully defended that title, and I'm committed to do so in the future as well. Second. When I received your invitation to address the meeting, I was deeply impressed because so many think tanks from so many important countries, and I can admit that when I was not a child but a student, and when I was realizing what it means being a think tank and working for a think tank, it was perhaps the most fascinating dream ever to become a member of a distinguished think tank in my later life. And today I must confess I didn't make it. It's a pity, but I have now the privilege discussing with you and learning from you what we, the politicians, have to not to do, but what we have to change and to improve in order to better serve the 7 or 8 million people around the world. We have decided to take on our responsibility for organizing this G20 summit. And your conference is in a very important and decisive moment. It's in the aftermath of G7 and the NATO summit, and it's literally almost the eve of the G20 summit. And therefore, let me at the beginning refer to the claim of our presidency. It is, we need to shape an interconnected world. And this is perhaps more important than it looks in the first sight, because we have realized that technological progress, that the existing risks with regard to climate change, migration, poverty, terrorism, and many others can be solved and tackled only in an interconnected world and not by some member states, some nation states, some sovereign states on their own and alone. And this is something that I have learned over all my political career, that in this ever-growing, globalized world, there is no single country able to provide leadership. No single person is able to provide leadership. But what we have to build instead is a world where we have a interconnectivity that will allow us to produce results from bottom up in the civil society, but also in the political arena, where we have to shape structures for cooperation structures for governance worldwide. And to give you an example or two in this context, one is we are all talking about digitalization. We are all talking about the enormous changes with regard to cyber, with regard to the spreading of information, the processing of information, the storage of information, big data mining, how to how to provide global solutions to local problems, for example, with regard to precision farming and many, many others. But we have so far not at all a sufficient governance structure to deal with all the ongoing changes in that world. To be clear, the technological change and progress and innovation is not steered by politicians. It is driven by existing problems and the wish to resolve them. It is driven by technological possibilities and innovation, and it is moving faster than in any moment of human and mankind's history before. We cannot decide which type of smartphone or tablet will be convenient in 20 years' time from now. We will not decide on whether autonomous driving will become a reality in all our countries. We are not deciding whether civil drones or telemedical applications will become everyday business. But what we have to provide is a framework, is a structure where you can discuss all the problems and all the risks related to the change that is underway. And this is one of the purposes why we have devoted this G20 meeting to shape an interconnected world. And the second example is something you have already, as I was told, discussed yesterday. It is the enormous challenge with regard to migration. Migration, the issue of refugees from civil wars, refugees from bad governance, refugees due to climate change in some countries, especially in the south of Africa. All these phenomena are not at all new phenomena. We know about them for many, many decades already. But it seemed in the past that all these phenomena have been local or regional phenomena. And what we have learned in the Syrian refugee crisis is the fact that today you cannot contain such catastrophic events like the dismantling of states and governments as it happened in Syria, as it happens in other countries in that region. You cannot contain it just to the region concerned. And to recall this moment 1.5 years ago in September 2015, when 30,000 refugees from Syria and Iraq have already arrived in Hungary and Austria. 30,000 were on the road between Greece and across the Balkan countries like Macedonia and Serbia. 30,000 people already arrived from Turkey to the Greek islands, and 2.5 million people, today there are 3.5 million people staying in Turkey, and 2 million people staying in Lebanon and Jordania, and looking for perspectives to have a decent life and a chance for a better future. And at that moment, when all these people tried to come to Europe and to come to Sweden, to Germany, to the Netherlands, to Luxembourg, to France, at that moment we realized that no sufficient structure did exist, neither on an international level nor on a European or on a national level. There has not been such a thing as a good working international framework. Of course, UNHCR and the World Food Programme had excellent skills and manpower and women power. But at the same time, they were running out of money. and they had to reduce the amount of money available for feeding the refugees in the country where they were staying. And all the important heads of states and government around the world did not realize what was underway until it was almost too late. And then when these people arrived in Greece and they made the journey, 7 days journey across the Balkan countries, there has been no preparation in hotspots to avoid humanitarian catastrophes. There had been no sufficient structures to deal with applications for protection and asylum. And when Germany decided in the beginning of September 2015 to admit tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in its territory to deal with that crisis, it had two aspects. One aspect has been to help people in extremely difficult conditions to avoid a humanitarian disaster. This is what we call the humanitarian imperative. And we know we are not the only ones. There are many countries in Africa, many countries in Asia who did exactly the same when they were confronted with refugee movements in their neighborhood. And the second was to buy time, to make it possible to assume our international responsibility, our geostrategic responsibility to work with the UN special organizations, to work with IOM and UNHCR, to work with our European partners in order to achieve a more sustainable solution for all of this. And we have achieved a solution where fewer people are coming to Europe, and at the same time, the living conditions for refugees staying in Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Jordania have been considerably improved. We are far away from a solution that we so desperately need, but we have achieved in less than 1.5 years, in cooperating with so many others, much more than many people had expected or had even hoped for. And therefore, we have now to look to the G20 process and its targets for the midterm and long-term future. We have been able as G20 to overcome what can be called the biggest world economic and banking crisis ever. And we have spent and devoted most of the time in the last years to talk about financial markets, to talk about the necessary to better control financial flows in order to limit the risk of financial bubbles and similar risks. And today, 8 years after this world economic crisis, we see the global economy is growing again, but recovery is still fragile. And recovery has taken place in some countries and in many other countries not, or even not to the extent that would be needed to avoid further disaster. And therefore, we have to draw the right and appropriate conclusions. And one of the conclusions we have suggested to our partners is that we should develop the G20 process beyond economic and financial aspects, that we should try to reduce economic, social, ecological, and political risk and safeguard growth through collective action. This is why we have our agenda based on 3 pillars, as you certainly know: building resilience, improving sustainability, assuming responsibility. It sounds good, it looks good, but it all depends on the concrete progress we can achieve in the framework of this process. We will, as far as migration is concerned, as far as living conditions is concerned, as far as climate protection is concerned, as far as terrorism is concerned, we will have to focus more on Africa and African problems as we have done ever before. And this is why we have, when we invited the G7 to Elmau 2 years ago, why we had decided to involve more than before African country leaders, and we will develop a partnership between G20 and Africa. To give you an example, when you take a country like Niger, then they have 18 million people today. Average age is 14. And by the end of the century, they will grow to a number of 100 million people. In this country that is considered as one of the poorest, least developed countries worldwide. At the same time, this small country of Niger, with 18 million people today and 100 in the future, is a transit country for almost 80% of the refugees coming from sub-Saharan countries to Libya in order to reach Europe by every means you can imagine. And that means we will have a chance to better deal with all the challenges when we better involve the countries that are affected immediately by all the risks that I have mentioned and by the process of migration especially. We have seen how much hope and how much debate was provoked when our Minister of Development Cooperation, Gerd Müller, who addressed the meeting as well, as I was told, when he was speaking about a Marshall Plan for Africa. It has been resonanced in many, many countries on the African continent. And regardless whether we, at the end of the day, will call it the Marshall Plan or whether we will call it in a different way, but we have to understand, in order to have a stable world, to have a stable framework for economic growth and welfare, we have to consider not just the situation in our own countries, but we will have a sustainable, a safe, a stable framework for our own development when we focus on global changes, on global risk, on global developments. That is something that we have to learn. And that means foreign affairs, security are back on the political agenda. But they are back in a different way than they have been on the political agenda 30 years ago, 40 years ago, in the Cold War. Then foreign affairs and security was discussed in terms of rockets, in terms of tanks, in terms of military capabilities. Military capabilities still are important. And therefore, Germany feels obliged and bound by the results of the NATO summit 3 years ago, and where we have adopted a roadmap in order to improve our military capabilities. But today, we have to realize that foreign affairs and security issues are closely related to education. They are closely related to professional training. They are closely related to the question whether we can enable people, especially women in African countries, to take a more active part, not only in the economic process of producing GDP, but also in the political debate in the countries. And we have a genuine and warm interest to avoid unstable, fragile, corrupt governance by encouraging governments with responsible politicians who have an idea what it means to live in a state where the rule of law and democracy are at least an aim for the midterm and long-term future. Because we have learned over the last years that democracy as such is not a guarantee for economic success, but without democracy, market economy and rule of law, the chance of having a flourishing, a successful economy is much smaller than it would be otherwise. And then the second point is how to make it possible when we are developing these countries, when we are improving GDP growth, how to make it possible that everyone can participate in that growth, can benefit from that growth. That the growth is not just reserved to few people in key positions, but that so many million, and I would even say billions of people dreaming of their own car, of their own a tablet, a personal computer, dreaming of TV, dreaming of spending holidays abroad, dreaming of nice dress and clothing, and so many other issues. How we can help these people to realize their dreams. Otherwise, there are people, as soon as they have even modest financial means, will try to go to Europe, to go to the US, to go everywhere where the perspectives are more attractive than in their own countries. And that would mean risking to deepen the gap. And this is why, for example, when Wolfgang Schäuble, our finance minister, served as a minister of the interior 12 years ago, he was discussing new concepts of migration. On the one hand, it is true that in European countries, and one day in America as well, and in China as well, we are relying on labor market migration in order to use the potential economic growth that we have. But at the same time, if we would invite and admit all the people who would be interested in moving to Europe or to the US, we would deprive many African countries of their elites. And how can you avoid a brain drain and convert it into a brain gain? That is one of the big challenges we have to discuss, and we cannot solve it and discuss it only on a national level. We have to do it on a European and an international level. And therefore, there are, from some think tanks in the past, developed ideas and concepts of a kind of circular migration. I'm not going into the details. I have thought a lot about it, and I think it deserves a closer consideration at least. There are certainly other possible concepts and other good ideas, and therefore we are looking forward what you as the think tanks can recommend to us. Politicians are always in a difficult situation. They have the same ideals. They are sometimes even not too stupid. They have the ambition to do a good job. But politicians are spending much of their time in addressing meetings, in attending summits, in campaigning for re-election. And you, as the members of the think tanks, you have the freedom, you have the margin of maneuver of thinking it through. The Romans, the old Romans, Virgil, has made this slogan, rerum cognoscere causas, and it means you have to understand the root causes of the things around you, and you have to find the appropriate solution because you cannot have an economy that works on the basis of voodoo economics. You cannot have foreign and security policies that work on the basis of voodoo policies. No, you have to work on very concrete challenges and to have to discuss the possible solutions that are appropriate, that can work in a world that is like it is. And this is what we expect from your conference today. Thank you so much for handing over to me your recommendations. We will study it carefully. We will prepare the summit as good as we can. We can, of course, not decide on the results by our own. We have to try to achieve a consensus. And what became clear after the G7 and the NATO summit is that a national responsibility is always, will always be there. In Europe, we have understood that we have to combine, we have to pool our sovereignty in order to have more and bigger impact on international debates. But even if European integration would be much bigger and greater as it is today, at the end of the day, we need solutions that are negotiated, that are agreed amongst all the important regional organizations, amongst with the involvement of the UN organizations, and especially amongst the most important economic players worldwide. And your activities, your conference, but also what you are doing at home, will enable us to achieve progress. Perhaps not in one step, but step by step. That is our aim, and therefore we will work as good as we can. Thank you for your attention.